Good afternoon. Today we will be discussing W.B. Yeats's poem The Second Coming. The Second Coming is a poem written by the Irish poet William Butler Yeats in 1919. It was first printed in the Dial in November 1920 and afterwards included in his 1921 collection of verses titled Michael Robartes and the Dancer. The poem uses Christian imagery regarding the apocalypse and second coming to allegorically describe the atmosphere of post First World War Europe. According to Ellman, Yeats's biographer, Yeats wrote this poem in January 1919 in the aftermath of war and revolution. He says that when Yeats wrote the poem, his mind was on the Russian Revolution and its menace, particularly to aristocrats and to antithetical men. In a way instantly familiar to a student of Blake and Shelley as Yeats was, the revolution suggests an apocalypse and the time of troubles preceding it. One of the most famous poems in the English language, The Second Coming is indeed the definitive vision of the Yeatsian apocalypse. It incorporates and intensifies ideas of cyclic creation and destruction, already articulated in poems such as The Magi, On Woman, The Phases of the Moon, and Solomon and the Witch, and more obliquely anticipated by the poem Easter 1916, where Yeats famously says, "All changed, changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born." In its unsettling concatenation of images and startling revision of Christian doctrine, the poem finds the sufficient formula for genuine myth-making, and in this respect goes beyond a poem like The Phases of the Moon, which, as Yeats admits, has the abstract quality of a text for exposition. The underlying mathematical figure of the Second Coming, as Yeats states in a lengthy note to the poem, is the cone or gyre interlocked with its opposite, the vertex of one centered upon the base of the other. This figure defines the relation, essentially, not only between the subjective and objective impulses within the individual, but also within the pattern of history. The end of an age, Yeats explains, and I quote, always receives the revelation of the character of the next age, and is represented by the coming of one gyre to its place of greatest expansion, and of the other to that of its greatest contraction. At the present moment, the life gyre is sweeping outward, unlike that before the birth of Christ, which was narrowing and has almost reached its greatest expansion. The revelation which approaches will, however, take its character from the contrary movement of the interior gyre. It says, all our scientific, democratic, fact-accumulating, heterogeneous civilization belongs to the outward gyre and prepares not the continuance of itself, but the revelation as in a lightning flash, though in a flash that will not strike only in one place and will for a time be constantly repeated, of the civilization that must slowly take its place, unquote. In a vision, Yeats expresses the idea more simply, and I quote again, after an age of necessity, truth, goodness, mechanism, science, democracy, abstraction, peace, comes an age of freedom, fiction, evil, kindred, art, aristocracy, particularity, and war, unquote. In the first stanza of The Second Coming, Keats envisions just this expansion of the life gyre in the figure of the falcon circling in a widening gyre beyond the command of the falconer, an image that Yeats had rehearsed in the fine poem earlier titled The Hawk in 1916. The image reverses the beatific downward gyre of the white gull in Demon and Beast, for example, such that the two poems in conjunction embody the double movement of the gyres as each dies into the life of the other. The image also interestingly reprises the central image in The Wild Swans at Cool, the private bereavement of the earlier poem writ large as a symbol of universal dissolution, of anarchy loosed upon the world, of the blood-dimmed tide drowning everywhere, the ceremony of innocence, quote unquote. This is something like the ceremony of innocence that Yeats wishes for his daughter in the poem A Prayer for My Daughter, which immediately follows in Michael Robartes and the Dancer and in the collected poems. In autobiographies, Yeats recalls his conviction as a young man that the world had become quote unquote a bundle of fragments, but he finds that he did not foresee, to quote again, the growing murderousness of the world. And in fact, he quotes the first stanza of the Second Coming to emphasize the point. Yeats wrote the Second Coming, as I told you earlier, in early January 1919. Its sense of murderousness conceivably encompasses the First World War, the Easter Rising, and the Russian Revolution. The Anglo-Irish War, which has its greatest poem in 1919, was then brewing, but it did not commence in earnest until January 21st, 1919. Yeats specifically mentions Russia in a draft of the poem by saying, and I quote, "The Germans are now to Russia come, though every day some innocent has died." Critic John Stolworthy notes that by the end of July 1917, the Russian front had crumbled in the face of the enemy. In October of that year, the Bolsheviks brought off their revolution, and at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on 3rd March 1918, Lenin had surrendered to the Germans Finland, Estonia, Courland, Lithuania, and extensive tracts of Russian Poland. Interestingly, in an April 8, 1936 letter to Ethel Manning, Yeats emphasized the political implications of the poem, and he says, "My sense of reality deepens, and I think it does with my age. My horror at the cruelty of the governments grow dear. Communist, fascist, nationalists, clerical, anti-clerical, all are responsible according to the number of their victims. I am not being silent. I have only used one vehicle I possess, verse. If you have my poems by you, look up a poem called The Second Coming. It was written some 16 or 17 years ago and foretold what is happening," unquote. Whatever its political relevance, The Second Coming shares the understanding of autobiographies that the growing murderousness of the world is a mere symptom of the culture's fall from unity of being into the bitter comedy of self-division. Under these circumstances, the best lack all conviction, as Keats famously said, being out of phase with their era and profoundly discouraged, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. As many commentators have noted, these lines closely follow Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, lines 625 to 628, where Shelley says, "The good want power, but to weep bearing tears. The powerful goodness want words need for them. The wise want love, and those who love want wisdom. And all best things are thus confused to ill," unquote. The passionate intensity of the worst most likely has a personal as well as a global resonance, recollecting those who impeded and harassed Hugh Lane, James Synge, and Charles Stewart Parnell, and obstructed Yeats's own enterprise of Irish cultural renaissance. The second stanza of the poem, echoing the desert scene in the final stanza of another poem titled Demon and Beast, stages the vision of destruction by which modernity is to be undone. Convinced that the second coming must be at hand, for the condition of the culture is unsustainable, Yeats sees a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi, or the world spirit, a version of the Anima Mundi, that is the central concept in Yeats's esoteric philosophy. In his notes to Lady Gregory's Visions and Beliefs in the West of Ireland, 1920, Yeats attributes the concept of the Spiritus Mundi to the Cambridge Platonist Henry Moore, and describes it as a pervasive, vital spirit that contains, he says, and I quote, all forms, so that the parents, when a child is begotten, are which, when the double is projected as a heir, but as it were, call upon the spiritus mundi for the form they need, unquote. In a note to an image from a past life, Yeats describes the spiritus mundi as a general storehouse of images which have ceased to be a property of any personality or spirit. In this case, the mind's eye calls forth from the spiritus mundi a desert scene in which the shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while above real shadows of the indignant desert birds, as if the noble solitary falcon of the opening stanza has been reborn as some form of an anti-self. The Sphinx image recurs far more complexly in the double vision of Michael Robartes, where along with the Buddha, it flanks the dancing girl who embodies the transcendental stasis of the 15th lunar phase. In a vision, Yeats calls the Sphinx an image of the outward-looking mind, love and its lure, and Buddha an image of the introspective knowledge of the mind's self-begotten unity. And he notes that these figures stand like heraldic supporters guarding the mystery of the 15th phase. The Sphinx of the double vision of Michael Robartes seems a symbol of eternity rather than an agent of apocalypse, but it shares with the Sphinx of the second coming its blank and pitiless stare, a motif likewise significant in poems as diverse as A Bronze Head, for example, The Cat and the Moon, and The Phases of the Moon. In its chilling final lines, the second coming crossbreeds its dark cyclic vision with the traditional Christian mythos of the second coming. We can refer to Matthew 24 and Revelation 19. Like most mutant Christ, the rough beast, its hour come round at last, unquote, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born, not in an initiation of a final heavenly peace, but in perpetuation of the violent revolutions of history, and in annunciation of the birth of a new age, as in the Magi. As Richard Ellman writes, and I quote him, the final intimation that the new God will be born in Bethlehem, which Christianity associates with passive infancy and the tenderness of maternal love, makes its brutishness particularly frightful, unquote. Yeats provides the relevant metaphysical framework in a vision when he says, and I quote again, at the birth of Christ took place, and at the coming antithetical influx will take place, a change equivalent to the interchange of the tinctures. The approaching antithetical influx and that particular antithetical dispensation for which the intellectual preparation has begun will reach its complete systematization at that moment when the great year comes to its intellectual climax, unquote. Where the primary era of Christ is, according to him, dogmatic, leveling, unifying, feminine, human, peace its means and ends, the antithetical era of the beast will be expressive, hierarchical, multiple, masculine, harsh, surgical. Yeats punctuates the entire discussion by quoting the second coming's description of the Sphinx, the physical and mythic symbol of the antithetical influx he describes. As to when this revelation was supposed to occur, Lady Gregory records in a journal entry of November 3rd, 1925, Yeats's prediction that the next revelation, that of the second coming, will come perhaps not for another 200 years. This is what the journal says. Yeats explores similar ideas of annunciation in another poem of his, Leda and the Swan, which also pictures the violent pangs of an antithetical age. His poetic corpus reveals that Yeats considers the Trojan War that was set in motion by the rape of Leda, the birth of Christ, and an indefinite event due to happen in our century, the birth depicted in the second coming, to be the three fundamental crises in world history, each of which reversed the established order and ushered in a new cycle of civilization. So these are the issues that have to be kept in mind both contextually and with regard to the text of the second coming, so that we can understand the poem in its entirety better. Thank you.